Not only is the Fed increasing interest rates at the fastest pace since the 1980s, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell once again suggested the increases will continue.
We have some ground left to cover here, and cover it we will.
Progressive politicians here in Washington are speaking out against the Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes as the prospect of hundreds of thousands of Americans being thrown out of work and even a global recession loom, not least because there's more and more data that suggests low unemployment and slightly higher wages aren't what's driving inflation. In fact, wages aren't even keeping up with inflation. The pandemic, supply chain issues, the war in Ukraine, these have been major drivers of inflation. But when Josh Bivens surveyed the numbers, he found another major driving force: corporate price gouging.
And in normal times, corporate profits are supposed to be around 12 or 13% of prices, but then their contribution went to well over half. So an enormous change. Through the second quarter of this year, it's still really elevated.
Clearly, the Fed's policies will increase pain among workers, in Jerome Powell's words, as unemployment and poverty increase. But they also may have other effects. Workers at this Home Depot in Philadelphia are voting this week on forming a union, part of a wave of labor organization across the U.S. at a time of low unemployment and an awareness of record corporate profits. But there are fears here that higher unemployment will snatch away that new worker confidence.
Throughout the entire pandemic, we had a now hiring sign up, which told me there's leverage there. This is kind of a precarious game, right? Because you also have the Fed coming in, jacking up interest rates, trying to induce a recession, trying to increase unemployment.
However, Vince Quiles says although it's true that higher unemployment and fewer job vacancies, the stated goals of the Fed, may make some workers reluctant to unionize at all, younger generations who've experienced nothing but economic crisis have simply had enough and are likely to push on regardless.
The younger people, look, I'm 27, I grew up throughout the Great Recession, the Iraq War. The economy's been really crappy for us, and so there was kind of that era of like, look, things are already bad. We might as well take a shot and try and improve something.
In the 1980s, the Federal Reserve was quite open. It was using interest rate rises to smash union power and moderate wages. The Fed insists that that's not the intention this time around, and certainly at this Home Depot, workers hope for a different outcome. Shihab Ratansi, Al Jazeera.
World is suffering from inflation. This is not some kind of fluke. This is not some kind of mere coincidence. This is because all these major central banks created inflation at the same time. Quantitative easing didn't just happen in America. It happened in Europe. It happened in Japan. Artificially low interest rates weren't purely an American phenomena. All the world's central banks had artificially low interest rates. So every central bank created inflation. They all sowed the winds of inflation, and now people all around the world are reaping the whirlwinds. But ironically, the main reason that interest rates were so low in Europe was because they were zero in the United States, and because Europe wanted to stimulate their economy by having lower interest rates than we had in the United States, because we're the reserve currency. And so for them to have a stimulative policy, they needed to get their interest rates lower than U.S. interest rates. Well, we were at zero. So the only way to go below zero was to go negative. As crazy as that was, that's exactly what they did. So the reality is, America is the primary reason that the entire world is suffering from such high inflation. But as a result of that, America actually ironically benefits and has lower inflation than everybody else. But that benefit has a short shelf life. In fact, we don't have lower inflation because we're doing things right and the Europeans are doing things wrong. We don't have lower inflation because of anything that we've done right. We have lower inflation because of all the things that the other countries have done wrong. So it's all on a relative basis. The dollar is only strengthening relative to other currencies. It is weakening in terms of purchasing power, but because other countries are also making mistakes, then they're having inflation. We're making similar mistakes. The fact is, we're actually making the mistakes on a grander scale, but because we have the exorbitant privilege of issuing the world's reserve currency, and a currency that everybody buys when they're worried about their own currency, we are benefiting from the mutual mistakes that everybody is making. And because the dollar is strengthening relative to the euro, that is helping keep our inflation low, but pushing European inflation higher. So it's purely a function of the dollar's reserve currency status and safe haven buying that is keeping our inflation low. It's got nothing to do with anything we've done right. It's got everything to do with other people are doing wrong. But since we're doing wrong too, eventually that's going to come back to bite us. And when it will is when the dollar starts to fall, which it already is doing. And the pace of that fall is going to accelerate as we get more economic data that is weaker than expected, and as more and more people begin to figure out that the Fed has pivoted and start pricing that in a bigger way to the foreign exchange market, to the gold market. And once the pendulum swings in that direction, it is going to keep on swinging. And so the U.S. inflation rate is going to get higher as the U.S. economy gets weaker, and that is going to prompt even bigger deficit spending. We're going to get even more fiscal stimulus. And of course, monetary policy is probably also going to adjust, because there's no way you can have more fiscal stimulus without monetary stimulus to make it all possible. So then the Fed has to do a U-turn and go from quantitative tightening to quantitative easing. And that's when the dollar falls through the floor and then inflation goes through the roof. And in fact, you got Jeremy Siegel out there who's all over the place in the news now, claiming that the inflation battle has already been won, and that the Fed is now way ahead of the curve and it doesn't need to keep tightening as aggressively because it's already won. Now, Jeremy Siegel was correct, and I gave him props at the time for saying that the Fed was behind the curve, for saying that inflation was not transitory and the Fed was making a mistake. And Jeremy Siegel was right then. He's wrong now. The Fed is still behind the curve. The Fed hasn't won the inflation battle. It's not even close to winning that battle. But what guys like Jeremy Siegel and other people are doing, they're pointing to home prices and they're saying, look, real estate prices are falling. That's a sign that inflation is over. And he points to the fact that a couple of years ago, when real estate prices were rising, the Fed was ignoring that, and they were just focusing on the shelter component of the CPI, which was dominated by owner's equivalent rent, and that owner's equivalent rent was barely rising. And so he said, hey, the Fed should ignore owner's equivalent rent and look at home prices. Well, now he's saying the same thing. He's saying the Fed needs to ignore owner's equivalent rent that is rising and instead focus on home prices that are falling. So at least he's consistent in that respect. But the reason I think he's wrong about just looking at home prices is because home prices are not the real determinant of the cost of shelter. What you pay to buy a home is like the admission ticket to home ownership. But what's important is not what it costs you to get into your house, but how much it costs you to stay in your house. The cost of home ownership continues to go up at an accelerating rate. And that is going to factor into owner's equivalent rent. And in fact, for a long time, I was talking about the lag between owner's equivalent rent and home prices and actual costs related to owning a home, because a lot of those costs get factored in to what rent would be, but not just rent, but what you pay to own a home. And the costs that I am referring to are, number one, the mortgage. So even if the price of the house that you're buying comes down, if the interest rate on the money you have to borrow to buy that house goes way up, it can still cost you more. It all depends on how much higher the interest rate is. And what Americans are really buying when they buy a home is the monthly payment. The actual price they pay for the home is irrelevant, because most people are never going to pay off their mortgage. All they care about is, can I swing the monthly payments? So that's what they look at. They say, how much will the monthly payments be if I buy this house? And what's happening now is, as prices are dropping, mortgage payments are rising. And in fact, it's rising interest rates that are suppressing home prices, because that's the only way somebody can afford to buy when the interest rates are higher, is if the purchase price is lower. But
and whatsoever you shall ask in my name, that will I do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. If you shall ask anything in my name, I will do it. If ye love me, keep my commandments.